Hi, I'm Emma.
And I'm Helena, and we both work at the MS Trust. Just a little disclaimer, we're recording this over Zoom, so apologies if the sound is iffy at any stage. Please do bear with us.
We'd like to welcome you to our podcast, Multiple Sclerosis, Breaking It Down. And this week we're going to be talking about one of the most talked about symptoms of MS. That's fatigue.
Fatigue. It really is that one symptom that a lot of people with MS have experienced. And MS, as you might know, is a very varied condition, and there's so many symptoms that quite often two people with MS are not alike. But fatigue, like I just said, is quite often something that most people with MS has experienced one point or another.
Yeah, so we're going to be hearing about some of your own experiences of living with fatigue today. But first, let's do a quick MS Fatigue 101.
Fatigue is a tricky subject, and it's something that affects an awful lot of people with MS. So I thought before we start talking about what people with MS feel like when it comes to fatigue, we wanted to have a little chat with someone from the information team, because I'm guessing that fatigue is a common topic that pops up in conversation.
Absolutely. It's one of the most common symptoms of multiple sclerosis, and we hear a lot of people struggling with it, and we hear from a lot of people who want to know what they can do to manage fatigue and what might be causing it.
Yeah. And the voice you heard there, that's Claire. She's been on the podcast before. She's works in the information team. And I think, let's start from the beginning, shall we? What is MS fatigue?
The most common description is to say it's a feeling of complete exhaustion that's out of all proportion to any activity that you might have been doing. So it's perfectly reasonable to feel tired if you've been exercising or you've not had a lot of sleep. But fatigue in MS is more than that. It doesn't seem to be connected to how much activity you've been doing or anything like that. It can be sudden. It can mean you can suddenly sort of run out of energy and not be able to finish something. Or you can start the day with MS fatigue and it might not lift. And of course, this in MS, fatigue can mean physical fatigue, but it can also mean mental fatigue as well.
And what does actually cause it?
It's a little bit difficult to be sure, but I think one good analogy is to think about roadworks in your town. If you've got roadworks all over the place, like MS lesions on your nerves, the messages from brain to body can't get around as easily, and it takes a bit more effort to get there. So you might, your commute might take longer. Your brain might take longer to get the information back from your feet. For people with MS, the nerve damage that's caused by MS could be a big contributory factor to be what's causing the fatigue. But that would be the primary cause. There's other ways that fatigue can hit in MS and that might be secondary effects, so caused by just the effort involved with living with MS. So things like low mood, depression, being in pain, or having disturbed sleep, or having to spend a lot of time thinking about going to the toilet. Those can all make fatigue worse. They add to that pressure.
That makes sense. And I guess it's sort of different from different times of year. Every winter, I get surprised that, why am I so tired? And then I remember looking at sort of Facebook memories and things like that, I was this tired last year as well. And it just seems to really kind of come and go.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of factors involved that could be quite individual. If you're particularly prone to some kinds of MS symptoms at some kinds of the year, or if there's other kinds of effort, other things like stress or an infection or poor diet, anything that sort of brings you down, it might be more likely to make your fatigue worse.
And heat obviously is a big culprit, isn't it? How many people with MS get fatigue?
It's not really clear how many people are affected, and researchers sort of report all sorts of different things, but I think it's fair to say that at least half people with MS, and maybe almost everybody with MS, notices it at some point. It really is one of the most common symptoms in MS.
I mean, every time we post about it, we get so much responses. It's does seem like it's definitely more than 50. But
and the difficult thing is that you can't see it. It's not like you're walking around with a sling or a crutch. It's for somebody on the outside, they just might not notice.
Yeah.
and you could be really struggling and suddenly have to stop and nobody understands why.
Yeah. What can you do if you have MS fatigue? What's the approach?
There's a mixture of two approaches that seem to work. On the one hand, make sure that the energy you've got the best possible amount of energy. So things like eating really healthily, using exercise to manage your activity levels, getting enough sleep, reducing stress, improving your mood. And they're easy to say, they're not always very easy to do, but they're all about making sure that the reservoir of energy that you start with in the day is as good as it can be.
Yeah.
And then the other aspect for managing fatigue is learning how to use that energy in the most efficient way. So the 3 Ps, I guess: planning, prioritizing, and pacing yourself. So planning in advance, so you're not wasting energy on things you might not need to do or want to do, saving the energy for good things that will really improve your life and your mood, and get you, achieving the goals that you want for yourself. And then pacing yourself, not asking yourself to do everything all at once, but recognizing that you might need to build in rest periods to make sure that you can get through things.
I think it's we sometimes hear about the spoon theory when it comes to talking about fatigue, and a lot of people with MS will already know about this, but I quite like it, where they sort of say that you start the morning with, I don't know, say 10 spoons, and everything that you do will take away 1 spoon, so try and save, so you have at least 1 spoon left towards the evening. But it's easier said than done, isn't it?
I think so. I mean, life doesn't always give us
spoons.
It doesn't always give us warning of things that might come up, and not all of life can be planned. No. So that can be it can be difficult or distressing. But the key person in fatigue management is you, the person who's living with it and experiencing the fatigue. So there's going to be a bit of trial and error. You might need to see what works for you, see how you can, if spoon theory is something that resonates, then go with it.
Yeah, I think things like writing almost like a diary and seeing this is how it went, and I tried, because we often talk about having a symptom diary, or if you try something, say like, okay, well, I'm going to give up this and see what happens, but actually do that with fatigue as well. So sort of see, I did a bit of exercise today and it made me feel this, so tomorrow I'm going to try to exercise at this time instead, and see what that happens.
I think that's really sensible. It's like being a kind of citizen scientist, the noticing patterns in what you do, so not necessarily just relying on a one-off. So I exercised and now I feel tired, and the next day I felt better. Whether it's working out whether there's anything else going on as well. So repeating those sort of observations a few times and seeing if there really are patterns there. I think it's an excellent idea.
Yeah, it sounds a bit funny to say experiment on yourself, but it pretty much is that, isn't it?
It is. Well, that's what trial and error is. It's try a few things, but notice them, write them down and think about them, and perhaps get help from friends and family. Say, look, I'm trying some new patterns in my life. I'm trying to notice, will you help me notice when I seem to have more energy, when I seem to be able to say yes to stuff, what do you think the common factors are?
Yeah, because sometimes when you live with things like fatigue or cognition issues and things, you don't notice it yourself. And I have heard quite a few stories of partners with MS that sort of said, well, actually, when you started doing this, I noticed the difference and you had more energy. And the person with MS kind of go, did I? But it's because sometimes you don't really notice it when you're when you are lacking all the spoons.
yeah, absolutely.
I was going to say, speaking of apart from trying different things, what about treatments? We do get that question quite a lot. Is there any treatments?
It would be lovely to think that there was a medicine that you could take and it would make the fatigue go away. And unfortunately, the evidence is patchy. Some people in the past have been treated with something called modafinil, but these days, after a safety review, that's usually prescribed only for excessive sleepiness, and fatigue isn't quite the same as narcolepsy, that kind of thing. Some people have found that amantadine can reduce their fatigue, but this is actually only, we think maybe 1 or 2 people out of 5 people suffering fatigue will notice a benefit, and these are likely to be the people whose fatigue is mild to moderate, not necessarily severe. So it's sometimes used to treat fatigue. The evidence is a bit mixed. Medication isn't a solution to fatigue all by itself, and you're always going to need to use sort of fatigue management techniques as well. And I don't think there's any drugs that have been shown to completely cure fatigue for people. Maybe 1 or 2 out of 5 people have had some success with amantadine. So there's nothing that works for everyone. Unfortunately, it would be lovely if there was. But the kind of things we were talking about prioritizing and planning and pacing yourself are likely to be more effective. It is worth, though, having a think about your other medications, because there are some medications that can make fatigue worse. All kinds of things, regardless of whether they're for MS or not. And but in the world of MS, the kind of drugs that you might be prescribed for muscle spasms or stiffness or pain are often associated with an increase in fatigue. So it might be worth having a review of your medications if you're worried that they might be making a difference, and if you're finding that your fatigue is really unmanageable, then it could be worth having a look at that. And I include alternative medicines and recreational drugs as well. They all interact in your body, and it's definitely worth thinking about the whole pattern of the whole dose you're getting.
Yeah, and we were talking about patterns before. I certainly know when I've had vertigo and I've been taking medications for that tends to get me very drowsy. And then when you look at the leaflet and it said you do not operate heavy machinery, you kind of think, well, that would explain.
Absolutely. It's like you can try and fix one thing and make the other thing worse. And that's one of the really frustrating things about this.
It really is. Now, ending this, I just wanted to, I suddenly remember that we've shared a piece of research a few years ago that always gets super, people get excited about this. There was a cocoa trial a few years ago, wasn't there? If it would benefit you to drink a bit of hot cocoa to help with your fatigue.
Yeah, that's such a nice piece of research. Anything that means you can have something chocolatey and delicious and feel like it's doing you good. It might be worth trying. It's one of those things. Try it and see if there's a pattern. The research that you mentioned there, Helena, was all about some of the additional compounds that you find in cacao. You can get cacao more readily now in supermarkets than you used to be able to. It used to be that you could nearly always just get cocoa, but it's to do with the treatment. I'm not quite sure exactly, but I think if it's treated and it's called cacao, the powder that you buy on the shelves, it will have more of this particular substance that seems to be good at reducing fatigue. And starting the day with a hot cup on your hot milky drink with some cacao in could well help. We spoke to somebody, didn't we, who had found it really, really beneficial.
Sat next at an event, sat next to a lady who was in the trial, and she was actually one of these people who her husband had said, I really noticed a big difference in you in the morning after you've had your cup of hot cocoa and or cacao, so she was feeling better. We'll put in the episode notes. We'll put the link to the thing so you get the right thing, because I think it is important to know that it's not just any old hot chocolate.
Yeah, we had a little bit of an investigator to really look at the original research and check exactly what it was that they were using, and I think it's really nice. It's really nice. Research. I mean, it's possible that some of the effect was about, focusing on making a hot drink in the morning and you getting some routine and some structure in your day, and maybe that was a part of it. But you know what? If that was what works, then that's what works. Yeah,
and it's in the long stream of things, when it comes to things to try, then I think that's a plus one.
Yeah, definitely one to try.
Thank you so much for chatting to us today, Claire.
Anytime. Bye now.
Bye.
So Helena, I take it from what you said to Claire that you struggle with fatigue yourself.
Yeah, I think fatigue is one of those things that's probably one of my first MS symptoms, even before I was diagnosed. I used to get so tired. I just felt the urge to sleep in the middle of the day, and especially on those days where I wasn't even doing that much. So it could be the weekend, and I suddenly, had a nice lay-in, and then you suddenly felt like, oh, I could do with another nap at 12 o'clock. So I actually did go to the GP at one point because I thought this is getting ridiculous. And I had some blood tests taken, and they pretty much told me, congratulations, you're as healthy as an ox. And I thought, well, that's a very tired ox if that's the case. But it was really hard to sort of describe to people what I felt, because, everybody feels tired. But when you feel that kind of extra tired, it's just like, for what makes your tiredness more special than anyone else's?
Yeah, I think that's something we hear a lot about, people feeling really frustrated that when they say to others they're experiencing fatigue or it's something that they struggle with as part of their MS, lots of other people who don't experience it themselves will not really understand the difference between tiredness and fatigue. And there is obviously that difference, which is why we're doing this podcast.
And I think, most of us with MS, we've probably had that conversation with a friend at some point where you go, oh, I'm really exhausted. And your friend will go like, oh, yeah, me too. I went out last night, went to a gig, I drank a bit too much, and then I had to get up really early for a meeting. What did you do? And you go, nothing. I'm just fatigued. So yeah, it's not always easy to have those conversations with people who don't fully understand it.
We asked you on the MS Trust Instagram account to describe what fatigue means to you and how you would describe it to others.
Hello MS team, it's Carla King talking about fatigue. Fatigue for me feels like I'm completely detached from the world, like the world is going on around me, but I just feel really disconnected, which can be quite distressing. So the way that I've dealt with it over the years is just to let that feeling wash over me and let the fatigue wash over me, and then take my rest and reset whenever I can.
That was Carla who sent us in a voice note over WhatsApp.
And we've had quite a few responses, and we picked some. And someone said, it's like going the wrong way up an escalator. Everything takes twice as much effort to get exactly to the same place.
Someone else said they feel heavy and foggy. It's like fighting to stay awake after you've taken a sleeping tablet or a sedative when all your body wants to do is shut down.
Another comment was, I literally feel like I've shut down, can't open my eyes, can't move, literally can't lift a finger. I imagine fatigue is what it's like to be a boulder. Weirdly, if I do a bit of gentle exercise through it, I usually get the best rest, and it's like a reset. My MS has got a terrible sense of humor.
This one we've had quite a few times actually, that fatigue is like wading through treacle. So every moment or memory is just slightly out of reach, and people feel like they don't have the strength to push forward through that.
Yeah, we do hear the treacle comment a lot, or mud. And we also asked the same question on Facebook, and here's some other comments. Andrea said this: I feel like I'm being held down by rocks. My legs are made of lead, wearing concrete boots and wading through mud. When I'm over fatigued, I feel physically sick.
Yeah, there were quite a few comments actually about people saying they felt sick with their fatigue. So Carol on Facebook also said, a wave of sickness just comes over me and I just want to be quiet and left alone because I can't think straight and my limbs feel heavy and achy, a bit like when you have the flu.
And Anna described it as fatigue is the worst hangover and period cramps rolled into one, but no amount of rest eases the feeling.
We also asked for tips for getting through the day with fatigue and so-called life hacks. So Caroline, who's our Facebook volunteer moderator, said, just be kind to yourself, schedule naps, rest and delegate where you can.
And Andrew, he was on what me and Claire were discussing a bit. He said, create a fatigue diary, write everything down that you do from waking in the morning to going to bed. Rate each out of 10, 10 being really fatigued. Do that for a couple of weeks. Just even small things like showering, getting dressed, then the major things like housework, going to work, looking after other people. And you could delegate some of the tasks throughout the day, which might also help.
Yeah, that's a really good tip. Like you said, Helena, that you spoke to Claire about sort of trial and error. I think that's a really good way to go about it sometimes, and accepting that some things may work for you but not work for someone else, or vice versa.
I think that thing about noticing patterns, like if you actually write it down, you might see things in a different way than if you just sort of muddle through the day with it.
So Stefano said that planning your day so that you do the most active thing first thing in the morning, or whenever you have your the most energy, and then take it easy through the rest of the day, really helps him.
Andrea also talking about sort of pacing and planning. She said, make sure you pace yourself with proper rests, and also practice mindfulness so you do not waste valuable energy on things that do not matter. I think that's an important one, because I think quite often we feel the urge to just do a lot of stuff that doesn't always need doing.
I think that applies to everyday life, regardless of fatigue or not. Is it worth wasting energy on things that aren't important?
Yeah.
So Dan also said, rest is best. Don't assume it's MS causing your fatigue, and try to look at ways to manage it in every situation. Sometimes it's okay to give in and accept that you don't have the energy, as long as your mental health is ready for that. If not, it's always worth speaking to a specialist, as there are drugs specifically used that can help you manage your fatigue, and they can be effective for some people. Speaking of drugs and fatigue management is a tricky subject, as Claire mentioned. We wanted to see if there were any more tips on how you can manage fatigue from a health professional. So we spoke to Kate, an occupational therapist, about it.
Today we are talking to Kate Hayward, an occupational therapist, about fatigue management and MS. So the first question, how is fatigue most successfully managed?
So there are several evidence-based strategies for managing fatigue, and these can include a combination of exercise, psychological therapies, energy conservation techniques. I think one of the main things you need to do is think about how you're going to plan and prioritise where you want to spend your energy. People with MS fatigue often fall into a kind of boom and bust pattern of activity, where they'll try and do lots of things when they have some energy, but that tends to lead to a crash in energy levels later. What you want to try and do is get a consistency of the activities that you're doing, so that you can maintain your energy as best you can through the day and week. And that involves kind of resting kind of regularly throughout the day to keep topping up your energy levels. It can be helpful to speak to someone about how you can manage fatigue, so you can ask to be referred perhaps to an occupational therapist, maybe to physiotherapy or to psychology as well, so that you can get some advice on how to manage fatigue, and then start to test out the strategies which might work best for you.
Now, quite often we do struggle to talk about fatigue and explain fatigue to our friends and family. So what's the best advice that you can give us to sort of get friends and family to understand fatigue?
One of the reasons that it's hard for friends and family to understand fatigue is because it's an invisible symptom, so they can't necessarily see how it's affecting you, and especially because it varies kind of day to day and throughout the day. So I think you need to be open with your friends and family, and let them know how you're feeling, how fatigue is impacting on you, and share information with them that you've learned about fatigue. So if you can understand it as best you can, and then share that information with your friends and family. And you might want to signpost them to information that's available on the MS Trust website. It can be really good to have a kind of a coordinated approach to your fatigue management. So helping your friends and family to understand this is going to be beneficial for all of you. If they know kind of how it's affecting you, then you perhaps don't kind of have to worry or feel guilty that they think you're being lazy if you take a rest break. And it can also be helpful if you can agree with them kind of how you're going to share kind of different tasks, kind of so you can kind of delegate things and agree kind of when everyone's going to do different tasks throughout the week.
Obviously, if you're working, fatigue can be a huge, big issue. How do you best manage fatigue at work?
So taking regular rest breaks, making sure you have your lunch, and kind of eating and drinking regularly can help you to manage your fatigue at work. If you've disclosed your condition to your employer, then taking additional rest breaks can be agreed as a reasonable adjustment. So actually positive kind of early disclosure of your MS in the workplace has been kind of shown to be beneficial in research studies. So if your employers can understand how fatigue is impacting on you, then you can work with them to agree how you're going to manage it at work. And one of the ways to do that would be through taking kind of rest breaks. Other things that you can perhaps think about is exploring, actually, is the commute to work, are you finding that really fatiguing? Are you getting to work and you're already exhausted? Perhaps you can agree with your employers that you can work a couple of days from home to kind of reduce the impact that the commute might be having on you. Also, you could think about contacting the government's Access to Work service for an assessment. They might be able to look at whether your workstation is set up kind of appropriately so that it's as efficient as possible. Maybe you can explore things like voice-activated software, which might help you to save some energy from typing. Or maybe you can think about the chair that you're sitting in, whether that's as supportive as it can be so that you're saving some energy there. Or also they have a taxi kind of to work service, which you might be able to use again if the commute is really fatiguing. But I think the main thing is to perhaps think about disclosing your condition to your employer so that you can agree with them how you can best manage your fatigue at work.
Another thing that comes up quite a lot is the struggle with family life and fatigue. Do you have any tips for managing fatigue better when you have a young family?
So managing fatigue with a young family can be really difficult, especially when your sleep is disturbed. I think you need to, again, try to plan and prioritise what you're doing and when you can kind of save energy and when you can do different activities. It's good to try and have a coordinated approach with your partner or with family, so trying to agree with them kind of who's going to do what childcare kind of duties on which days, planning around the times when you might have more energy so that you're not having to kind of ask them to do things kind of when you're at the point of kind of exhaustion. Maybe you can think about getting some outside help, so perhaps can you think about getting a cleaner, especially for the kind of heavier household chores, or maybe there's things that you're doing kind of each day, each week that you perhaps don't have to do at all anymore. It can be good to think about areas where you might be able to save energy. So could you perhaps do online shopping instead of going to the supermarket? Could you buy kind of pre-chopped or kind of frozen vegetables so that you don't have to kind of use your energy for doing that part of the cooking task? And sometimes kind of doing batch cooking, so perhaps cooking all the meals for the week at the weekend when you perhaps have more time can be useful than kind of when you come home from a busy day at work. If you have older children, you could think about different activities that they might be able to help you with. And perhaps think about talking to your children about how fatigue might be impacting on you so that they can understand if you do need to have a rest, why you're perhaps not able to kind of play with them or help them at a specific point, but that you'll be able to kind of help them later.
And here's something that comes up now and again, especially on social media. Does diet have any impact on fatigue levels?
Yes, so eating regularly and keeping hydrated is an important part of fatigue management. There's no kind of specific diets that are evidenced at the moment to support with MS other than eating a kind of healthy, balanced diet in line with general government principles. Try not to avoid or try to avoid skipping meals, especially breakfast. And try and avoid relying on kind of sugary and caffeinated drinks because although they might give you a burst of energy, they can then lead to kind of a drop in energy levels later. Also, try and think about avoiding caffeinated drinks later in the day because that might impact on your sleep, which can then have a knock-on effect to fatigue levels.
And here's something that we also have spoken about in the podcast in the past. How does exercise help with fatigue?
So studies have shown that exercise can help to reduce fatigue in MS, and this is probably due to a number of factors. And finding the right exercise for you can be really helpful. So we know that when exercise tolerance is reduced, then the effort of doing things is more. So then that can kind of increase fatigue levels. And also kind of evidence has shown that just gradually kind of building exercise into your day and week can increase strength and stamina, even if you're adding that in at quite a low level. We also know that exercise can be positive for mood because it kind of releases endorphins into the body, which can have a positive effect on fatigue. And it also can help to improve your sleep, which again has a positive impact on fatigue. So if you want some specific advice about exercise in relation to your MS, perhaps speak to your physiotherapist who can give you some good tips.
Thank you so much to Kate at the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery for helping us out with making this podcast. Now, if this was a commercial podcast, here's where there would be an advert. But we're a charity, so we don't do that. So instead, we'd like to take the opportunity to tell you all about our fantastic resources for people with MS.
Our website, which is mstrust.org.uk, has tons of information and resources for people affected by MS. And of course, we have lots of information about fatigue on there. We even have a whole book dedicated to the subject. So if you head over to our A to Z of MS section and look under F for fatigue, you can find all the information from there.
And we'll also be putting lots of links in the show notes to have a look there too. And we're back.
Yeah, so it was great, obviously, to hear from Kate as well as Claire earlier. And I think one of the really key things from what Kate said was about essentially prioritizing what you want to do with the energy that you do have. I know this is a big thing for people who struggle with fatigue, and it's talked about quite a lot, but I think we're all a little bit guilty of trying to do everything all of the time. Even like from when we're quite young, it's something that's instilled into us, like do your best at everything, make sure you get everything done, try not to say no to other people. And actually, as you get older, you realize that saying no is not always a bad thing. It can really protect both, obviously, if your body, if you're struggling from fatigue, but also your mental health too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think having spent time away from each other, I suppose, a little bit during the whole pandemic, and you had to spend time more alone, you kind of realize that actually it's quite good to take that time for yourself and have a little think about what's priorities and what's not priorities, because living with fatigue isn't easy, and I think you just have to try what works for you. We've said trial and error so many times during this podcast, and I really think that's the way it is. I mean, speaking on a personal perspective, and I get this is not for everyone, my best fatigue pill is exercise. I did try medication actually, and it did not work for me. So for me, I have to do the exercise like first thing in the morning to get me started. And if I skip it, if I have a lay-in, quite often I feel like, I really want to have a lay-in. But then I'm just completely dead for the rest of the day, and I just can't sort of seem to get going. So I think it's that fine line of trying to push through fatigue sometimes, but not overdoing it, because then it come back and bite you later. And it's a tricky line to find. And I think that's where the trial and error and maybe keeping a diary works there. So you can sort of see if there is a pattern that, okay, but this works, I can do this much. And maybe the next day I'll do a little bit more and see if that tips over, then we'll scale it back. Because when I started my MS journey, I completely gave into fatigue. I overslept, I napped, I stopped going to the gym. I would often say no to doing anything sort of extra. I used to nap at work. I was open with my diagnosis, and there was a sofa close to a photocopier in the office, and I used to go there and have a little lay down. Didn't get a very good rest because the photocopier was massive and super noisy, so it wasn't the best of rest. And I used to use coffee as a crutch, and I guess for full disclosure, I still kind of rely on coffee a bit too much. I'm working on it. But it's taking me sort of 15 years since diagnosis to figure out the best way to deal with fatigue. But mostly I think you have to figure out what works for you. I think sometimes in the sort of chronically ill community, not just with MS. I've seen this joke pop up a few times. They say if you say chronically ill 3 times, someone will pop up and go, you should try yoga, it will cure you. And I'm using the inverted commas of curing here. So it really isn't a one size fits all. Some people might love yoga might work really well. Other people will hate it. And some people will struggle more than others with fatigue. So I think this is, for me, I'm going on about exercise, but I know that does not work for everyone. And saying that to some people will frustrate them because they know they can't do it. So it is really like that kind of finding. And there is also the small percentage where the medication might actually work. So I think the important lesson to take away from fatigue is that you have to try it, and maybe not just kind of push it to the side and kind of go, oh, well, it's just fatigue, there's nothing that can be done, because there might be some management that can work for you if you give it a try.
Yeah, it might not necessarily go away completely, but if there's something that you could do to make it better or manage it a little bit more simply in everyday life, then surely it's worth a shot at trying different things.
Yeah, and I mean, if it is a simple thing like, have a cup of hot chocolate, the proper hot chocolate in the morning, then that's a nice thing to try, isn't it? I think we heard some really useful things from Kate about how to manage it at work and with friends and family. And I think, the key is probably to be as open as you can be about how fatigue feels for you. And like you said, don't always feel like you have to do the stuff, because sometimes the stuff can just wait, especially when it's non-essential stuff. So be kind to yourself.
So speaking about fatigue, we're planning on doing something on this important topic during MS Awareness Week. So make sure you keep your eyes open on our website and our social media channels for more updates on that one. If you've got any great tips on how to deal with fatigue and want to share your story with us, then get in touch by emailing mystory@mstrust.org.uk. And do remember that if you have any questions about MS and fatigue or anything else MS related, then we're here for you. Our inquiry service is available Monday to Friday, except UK bank holidays, and that's from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And outside of these hours, you're welcome to leave us a message and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Our inquiry service number is 0800 032 38 39, or you can email us on ask@mstrust.org.uk.
And you can also find us on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. And you can find this podcast on Spotify, Google, and Apple Podcasts and Amazon Music. And get in touch, and like they say, like and subscribe. I would also like to say a big thank you to Ant Chapman Audio for the music of this podcast. Do you reckon we should go for a hot cacao now, Emma?
Yeah, it's worth a shot, isn't it?
See you next time. Bye.